appreciate the opportunity and kind of wanted to give you, as you know, coming to the end of the first term, and kind of give you my perspective, a little bit of an overview of what things are like in Washington. And I think one of the things that I learned first and the quickest was we talk about the partisan divide that exists in Washington. It certainly does, no question about it. But what we found, or at least from what I found in Washington, that the partisan divide is secondary to the geographic divide that exists in Washington. What I mean by that is urban versus rural, primarily. And so when we talk about trying to find ways to work together with folks, it's becoming increasingly more difficult to find common ground with urban districts. And in many cases, rural districts are kind of left out in the cold when it comes to the kind of support that we need. We're just as important, in my mind, as the urban constituents are. And yet, we're outnumbered. So it makes it much more difficult for us to advocate for our constituents. And that is one of the toughest obstacles to overcome. And so we look for opportunities to reach out to the other side and to be bipartisan in our approach. And I can give you an example of one of the most recent opportunities we've had. It's been very successful. A piece of legislation that I wrote in response to calls I was getting from farmers in our district that had to do with storing fuel on their farm. And the EPA was going to implement a rule that required what's called a spill prevention and containment countermeasure, basically building a berm or a dike around your farm fuel storage, if you were storing in excess of 1,320 gallons. Now that seems like a pretty small amount of fuel storage by our standards, because in East Arkansas, the producers here, economies of scale, they farm big. Consequently, they buy a lot of fuel. And so to require them to spend tens of thousands of dollars to build these spill prevention and containment countermeasures really was costing farmers money. Now, anytime you impart those kind of costs on farmers, ultimately, the consumer pays. First, it comes out of the farmer's bottom line. But that's got to be offset somewhere. Who pays for that? We do, as consumers. Because not only are we, we've got a lot of ag production here in this district, but we're also consumers. So we see these kinds of regulations that have to be paid for, and ultimately, we pay for those. And so what we tried to do was to apply some common sense. And so we came up with some standards that we thought met a more fair standard. And that is that you wouldn't be required to build this structure until you stored in excess of 10,000 gallons. A little more manageable. And then between 10,000 and 42,000 gallons, yes, you build the structure, but you can self-certify. Above 42,000 gallons would require the third-party engineer, professional engineer, and certification. Now, these standards didn't come out of thin air. They were actually pulled out of the EPA standards of the underlying 1973 Clean Water Regulations, Clean Water Act. And those standards were codified in 2006. By their definition, a small farm was 10,000 gallons. So we were using their standards. It wasn't arbitrary at all. And we saw that they were going to implement this rule in November of 2011. We intervened, wrote a letter I wrote the letter, and we had over 100 bipartisan signatures on that letter to the EPA Administrator, Lisa Jackson. That was in July of 2011. Never heard back from her. Never heard back from her. However, about the last week in October last year, we were notified by the EPA that they were going to delay the implementation of that rule until May of 2013. So I guess that was their way of getting back with us. But the point is, we were successful in delaying that rule because we worked together in a bipartisan fashion. Now, in the intervening months, as we waited for a response, we crafted this bill. It's called the Fuels Act, Farmers Undertaking Environmental Land Stewardship. And we like to use acronyms in Washington. I guess it's easier to remember. And so, anyway, the Fuels Act, we wrote that using those standards I just described. And we had probably 70 co-sponsors, I think. It was a very well co-sponsored bill, bipartisan support. And as this calendar year has drawn down, time is of the essence. We know that May 2013 is just around the corner, so we really got to get this bill passed. So believe it or not, this is a bill that affects farmers, but it comes under the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. So we had to work it through Transportation and Infrastructure. Went to the chairman, told him what was going on. He said, yeah, let's just go ahead and move this through the committee. Did not receive a single no vote in committee. Passed it out of the committee, sent it to the full House. And they said, okay, you're going to go and debate this bill. Okay, so we take it to the floor, and I'm controlling time in support of the bill, and then on the other side of the aisle, they're supporting time in opposition of the bill. That's how it works in any, legislative scenario, I'm sure. But the funny thing was, the guy that was controlling time in opposition was a co-sponsor of the bill. So nobody disagreed. So what we did, instead of debating the bill, we patted each other on the back and said, thanks for all your help. Passed it through the House without a single dissenting vote on the floor. Why do I bring that up? Because it's important that we really exploit those opportunities to be bipartisan every time we can. Now, we're going to have fundamental differences of opinion, but when it comes to stuff like this, when it comes to trying to really empower particularly our ag production base, that has no political ideology. That's about trying to secure our food supply and secure jobs and so on. And it's a great opportunity to push all the partisanship aside and say, let's come together on a bipartisan basis. And it worked well. So we sent that over to the Senate. It's now working through the Senate, and hopefully, it was introduced in the Senate, I think, last week. If they have the same response that they had in the House, it'll be a backslapping festival, and everybody gets along and sings Kumbaya, and the president signs it. Because it came out of a necessity, and it came out of a recognition that we all need to work together to make it easier for farmers to provide our food for us. And if we could take that approach on some other issues, I think we would have a lot more success legislatively and be able to do a lot more good in Washington. But what we found is that the ideologies a lot of times are as defined by geography as they are by politics. And that's one of the toughest obstacles that we face. All this was going on after we had passed the House version of the Farm Bill. And so, as excited as we were to move the Fuels Act, and as successful as that was, we had the Farm Bill hearing almost around the same time, or the committee markup right around the same time. And I want to tell you, in this environment, we were able to turn out what I think is a very good Farm Bill out of the House on a 35-11 vote in committee. Now, again, we've seen some pretty hard and fast lines drawn with respect to partisan identity on a lot of issues. But on the Farm Bill, 35-11 is a stellar effort. And it was a good Farm Bill. And we left there from that committee markup feeling that we had earned the right to take that bill to the floor. That was a good example of working together. And here's what happened. We worked together so well that leadership on neither side wanted to take up the bill. And here's why. We can get through the commodity title, we can get through the energy title, we can get through the conservation title, we can get through the livestock title, and we can agree on almost all that stuff, and then we get down to the nutrition title. And everybody slammed on the brakes. Both sides have a problem with the nutrition title. One says it cuts too much, the other says it doesn't cut enough. And so, when all the political wrangling is done, ultimately, the speaker has to be the one responsible for pulling the trigger on whether or not we're going to get that to the floor. He was concerned that there weren't the votes, that we didn't have the votes to pass it. But because the majorities in control makes that determination, ultimately they have to make the decision, and they're the ones that are going to get the slings and arrows, hopefully still. I'm a member of the majority party, so I'm getting slings and arrows. We've done everything that I know to do within the rules to try and bring a Farm Bill to the floor. What we have done is gotten the assurance from the Speaker of the House that we will bring the Farm Bill to the floor in November, right after the election. It's top priority. The Farm Bill is a victim of politics, and it's unfortunate. Many of our policy issues are victims of politics, instead of taking a look at the policy, it becomes political footballs. Historically, farm bills have been bipartisan, and they have not been this type of polarizing effect that takes place. Our last farm bill, 2008, was a year late. There were some political dynamics at play in the last farm bill. This farm bill is a good farm bill. Most every commodity group in the country said, yes, we support this bill. The Senate version didn't care for it at all. Neither of our senators, to their credit, voted for it. They voted against it because of what's on, they know better. The House version cleaned up an awful lot of the missteps of the Senate bill, but if we can't get it on the floor and get that bill to conference, we'll never be able to reconcile the two. And so we have the assurance from the Speaker of the House that yes, we're going to take it up in November. And I hope that the outcome of the election in either case doesn't change that commitment, and that we will be indeed able to bring that bill to the floor in November, get a conference, and move it out and let the President sign it. Because we need to provide that certainty. There are 16 million jobs in the United States that rely on agriculture, directly related to agriculture. And if we're not about anything in Washington, we ought to be about providing some level of certainty for jobs. And I've made that case time and time again. I signed a discharge petition that would force the bill to the floor. That's still circulating. It may not be necessary since the Speaker has agreed to bring it to the floor. But I just wanted to tell you that the discharge petition is not a popular move. They don't like it when you go around them and sign a discharge petition. Now, they might not like it, but they respect the rules, and it's part of the rules. So if we say, look, we understand that for whatever reason, whatever your motivation is, you don't want to bring the bill to the floor, but I've got to advocate for my constituents. We need a farm bill. This is a procedural maneuver that we can use to force the bill to the floor. So I, along with, I think we're up to 79 or 80 other members, have signed a discharge petition. That will continue to circulate, but as I said, it may not be necessary because the Speaker's already agreed to bring it in the run-up session. So I'm hoping that we'll be successful, because what I don't want to see happen is to mark up another farm bill in the 2013 session, because we don't know what that Congress is going to look like. This is a good bill, we know it is, and I would rather take this farm bill that we have now, get it out of the House, conference it with the Senate, and move on, than to roll the dice on an unknown coming up in 2013. So, the glass is half full. There's most of the programs that we rely on in our district will remain funded, so the September 30th deadline will not affect them. There are some that would be affected, but very small programs, and most of them not very big in this district. So there'll certainly be some effect, but very little. So we do have some time to maneuver. But at any rate, we're going to continue to work hard, and that's my #1 priority going forward, is trying to get that done. So I wanted to share the story about the success of the Fuels Act, and then contrast that with what we thought would be a fairly easy bill because of the history of bipartisanship. And as you can see, that when politics takes over, it makes things difficult. So working hard for you on that particular issue. I want to recognize some of our staff here. Richard, who is one of our field reps. Andrea Allen is the district director. She works out of the Jonesboro office. And Doug Smith, one of our field reps as well. They work very hard in the district. And funny thing about Washington and the district, we do an awful lot in Washington that has to do with legislative stuff. But we do a heck of a lot in the district that, to me, is the most satisfying, because we can meet a need today. And that is, if someone comes into the office and they said, we're having trouble with the Corps of Engineers, or we're having trouble with the DA, we're having trouble with Social Security, we're having trouble with Medicare, any number of issues that they may have with the federal agency, we're able to help them, and may be able to help them that day. But we are, generally speaking, successful in helping meet their need in a very short period of time. Compare that to what we're doing in Washington, where we're, debating fighting, fussing over legislative issues to what we're able to do here and accomplish for our folks here in the district. This is very, very gratifying that we're able to help and be that conduit between the constituents and the federal government. And I just say that to say this: if you've got any kind of issues that relate to a federal agency, don't hesitate to call us. That's why we're here. That's why our staff is here, because they are the ones that work those issues for you and hopefully bring those to a satisfactory resolution. So if we can ever help you with anything, be of any assistance, we're glad to do it. And before you leave, you want to grab one of Andrew's cards, so you have a point of contact. And then with that, we're happy to take questions.
I just want to commend you on, I've seen pictures of you giving books to the libraries. And that's, as a former school teacher, that's a great thing. I appreciate that you are doing that.
You bet. I appreciate you saying that. And what she's talking about is the Library of Congress has a surplus books program. And it's a very obscure program that most of the members weren't even aware of. But what happens is every book that's published, the Library of Congress gets multiple copies of it. And they will archive one copy, and the balance of those copies will likely be destroyed. In fact, it probably costs more money to destroy those books than it would to redistribute those books to libraries in need. So we got involved in the surplus books program. And as a result, we have delivered about going on 1,300 books thus far to libraries across the district. And we're encouraging.
I might say that I'm president of the library board here in town, and we'll be expecting ours.
You put in your application?
We will.
Okay, yeah.
I don't know what Janie has, but.
We encourage you to do that. Because in fact, I think, didn't we deliver some books yesterday?
Yeah, and tomorrow also.
Yeah, so we love doing that. It's a lot of fun. And they keep reapplying, and the more people get in the program, the longer the wait's going to be for a second delivery. But anyway, you're first in the rotation, so get that application.
Thanks, ma'am.
Certainly, I have to ask about the nutrition part of the farm bill and how it affects free and reduced lunch for schools.
Well, we're dealing with that on a couple of fronts. Obviously the funding of the House bill was $16.5 billion cut. But I want to be real clear about what that cut entails, because in Arkansas, the state of Arkansas has done a really good job in administering the federal nutrition program. And so virtually no effect to Arkansas with respect to those nutrition programs. The reason that we realized $16.5 billion in savings through this farm bill was that we identified some loopholes that could be closed and some exploitations that exist with people that are simply taking advantage that don't need to. For example, in the big urban centers, it's not uncommon for an individual to receive a LIHEAP check. And if you're not familiar with LIHEAP, it's a low-income housing home energy assistance program. Well, if you receive a LIHEAP check in any amount, it could be $5, in some states, you're automatically eligible to receive food stamps. And so what they would do to expand that eligibility, they would just send out somebody a $5 LIHEAP check, or maybe a $25 nominal check, just one-time check, that automatically makes them eligible for food stamps. Now here's my position on this deal. We know that people need assistance with nutrition. There's no question about it. But it's the ones who don't need it and take it that threaten the ones that do need it. That's what we have to be diligent about. And in the process of closing those loopholes, the benefit is twofold. Number one, we're being better stewards of taxpayer dollars. And number two, we're putting those resources to use where they're supposed to be and not to places where they shouldn't really go. And so, again, commend Arkansas because they do a great job, and we're not one of those states that has manipulated the system. But to give you an example, we did some oversight hearings, and there were 2 big grocery stores in Florida that in a year's time trafficked $6.5 million in food stamps. Trafficked $6.5 million. Now extrapolate that over the entire country, and you can see that there are a whole lot of folks. And it's not just the beneficiaries, but it's also the retailers. There are bad actors out there. So we're not trying to castigate any strata of society. What we're saying is the system is flawed because it allows for exploitation to such a degree that 2 stores by themselves accounted for $6.5 million of illicit trafficking. That's the kind of thing that's got to stop. Because the folks that need those resources are being compromised. And so, and to answer your question, the state of Arkansas sees very little effect on that.
And then, of course, with the First Lady's nutrition efforts,
Yes, ma'am.
we love to serve fresh fruits and vegetables. That's not exactly what kids want to eat.
Right.
They'd rather have chicken nuggets and fries. But regardless of that, it is more expensive to serve fresh fruits and vegetables and one more of either fruit and vegetable. And so we're just supposed to absorb that other piece of cost.
Well, here's the problem that we're running into, and you being a superintendent, we haven't got the date locked down on this, but we're actually going to have a school nutrition summit. Because when school started, we started getting phone calls. Because this is the first school year for the implementation of these new nutritional standards in schools. Now, I understand that as a society, we have some issues with obesity. I don't think we're going to fix that problem by compromising nutrition, because those kids who are on free and reduced school lunch, by definition, they're not being adequately nourished. Therefore, for many of them, the only nutrition they're going to get is at school. So let's not limit it to 600 calories, and we need to broaden our scope, I believe, what they should be able to eat. More protein, as well as fruit and vegetables and so on. And we're going to have some cultural issues, some societal issues to retool how we eat, because we've become a fast food society. I don't think we fix those problems by taking those drastic steps.
And that's 74% of our kids at Trumann.
Right. We had this conversation coming over here, and I was guessing that you would be in the 70 to 80% range on free and reduced. Some of the schools in the district, we've been out visiting, some are upwards of 90%. I was in Sloan Hendricks yesterday, they're at 65%. Most of the schools in this district are going to be upwards of 60% free and reduced school lunch. And when you've got that many that require, heck, many of them, that's the only meals they're going to get.
Exactly.
Some of them may not eat on the weekends.
Yes.
And, we're not going to fix our obesity problems with young people by taking these kinds of measures, because, like I said, many of them, that's the only food they're going to get. It's the only nutritious meal they're going to get. So, as I was going through the line at lunch, and this has been fresh on our minds. We've had this conversation already this morning with one school. We're going to do everything we can to try and address that and make more sense of it.
We appreciate it.
Yeah.
We've all been very concerned about our kids.
Well, the further into the school year we
Not
get,
getting other meals.
sure, the further into the school year we get, the more calls we're getting. In fact, I know of at least one football coach who is leaving his team out of his own pocket because they're not getting enough food at lunch to practice like at the level that they should be practicing. And when you got kids that are active in sports and things like this, we had this conversation down this end of the table. A 600 calorie meal may not be enough gas to get them through the day. So.
Growing 14-year-old boy up until about 18, it almost takes a village.
Well,
600 calories.
that's exactly right. And the other thing, just from the standpoint of trying to get kids focused, if they're hungry, it's going to be hard to teach them anything. And so I think we need to take a much more common sense approach to, certainly we want them to eat healthy. We want to apply, solid dietary guidelines, but I think that has to include some protein, carbohydrates that they have kind of dismissed, and I think we're missing some.
We have a meal on Wednesday nights, and we've noticed this year that our kids are more extremely hungry when they get there.
Yeah. Like I said, the further into the year we go, the more and more pressing this issue has become. I'm talking about the first week of school, we were getting calls.
Do you have anything to do with the food bank?
I go around to the food banks and visit with them a lot, and we have been successful in Jonesboro in getting some additional items donated. But whatever we can do to try and enhance what they're doing, broaden the community awareness to the mission, we're doing that. And
What I'm getting at, we'll say this lady here comes in there, she gets this
what's living, you know, runs. This lady come over here, has got 3 children. She gets the same thing as the lady with no children.
Mhm.
She needs more.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, and I think that, I would think food banks would have more flexibility than that, than, you know, if the
I've
federal
tried it for
government.
9 years, but they don't do anything.
That's something we probably need to work on too, because it obviously makes more sense if you've got more kids.
Uh-huh.
You would expect to have access to more food. Any other questions, comments?
I know this is not your committee, but you're on the act, but the ESCA, the Reauthorization of Schools Act, and the cuts in funding to Title I, which helps poverty
Right.
schools
Mhm.
with a lot of free and reduced kids, which were 74%. What is that looking like on the reauthorization and sequestration?
Well, I don't think sequestration will have an effect on that, and I think, I may have told you about the Student Success Act. You were at the Jonesboro Roundtable, I believe, too. The Student Success Act will bring a whole lot of changes to the current law, which is No Child Left Behind. There will be some cuts, but again, what we're doing is identifying some administrative areas and doing a better job of placing resources where they need to go, as opposed to just randomly, trying to reach a number. But I think that what you'll see as far as Title I goes, I don't think there'll be a whole lot of negative effect on Title I funding going forward. I think because of the reasons you just described. Thank you all very much, I appreciate it.